In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about how mineral deficiencies can heighten toxicity of certain heavy metals. Now, in the previous episode, I talked about how a certain subset of autistic children were found to have iron deficiency anemia in a couple of studies done in the USA and Canada. I've also talked to you before about how common zinc deficiency is in autistic children. In a previous episode where we talked about nutritional intake of autistic children, I talked about how calcium has been found in certain studies to be low in the diet, as well as selenium, right? So what I have some research I quote in my book. I'll give you an example. So iron deficiency increases absorption of cadmium, lead, and aluminum. These are very toxic metals. I'll talk about heavy metals in much more depth in future episodes. So iron deficiency increases absorption of cadmium, lead, and aluminum. Calcium deficiency can increase lead absorption. Zinc deficiency, we know many autistic children are zinc deficient. Zinc deficiency can increase cadmium absorption in the gut. Then, deficiencies of calcium, iron, and zinc enhance the negative effects of lead on cognitive and behavioral development. That, as you can imagine, is extremely important for children. You certainly do not want any lead toxicity to be exacerbated due to mineral deficiencies. And finally, from the research, selenium protects from mercury toxicity. So low selenium intake can increase the harmful effects of mercury. So these are, mercury, cadmium, aluminum, lead. These are extremely toxic metals that are also extremely prevalent in our environment, in the air, the water, the food supply, and in many, industrial applications in the home, garden, and all sorts of products. So we also know that, and I'll talk again, like I mentioned, I'll talk about in future episodes, that many autistic children not only suffer from increased heavy metal burden, but many of them have trouble detoxifying heavy metals because of antioxidant deficiencies and nutritional deficiencies and inadequacies, like, for example, the ones we're talking about today. So, what are you to do? Well, the number one thing is to start thinking about how you can include more minerals in your child's diet. So there's a couple of tests you can run. I'll talk about them in the future in more detail. I'm just priming you for this now. So one of them is a hair tissue mineral analysis, just a hair test, which you can test not only for things like zinc, calcium, selenium in the hair to see levels in the hair. You can also test for mercury, aluminum, lead, things like that. So it's a good test to see what your child has been excreting. And generally, the way it works is with the heavy metals, if they're very low, if they're too low, it generally indicates that your child might be having issues detoxifying those heavy metals. If they're very high, it could mean acute recent exposure. And in terms of the zinc, calcium, selenium, if they're low in the hair, it tends to show a low nutritional status over the last several months. So these are all indications, that's something you can do about it with your practitioner. So that's one thing I would recommend. Hair testing is very cheap compared to other tests. So that's definitely something you need to ask your practitioner about. And the other thing you could do is you could run a specialized blood test that looks at red blood cell minerals and other nutrients. So that's another way to check for deficiencies. Obviously, you want to catch deficiencies and address them with minerals. Your practitioner should be able to tell you what to do. And if there's any heavy metal burdens, then you obviously the minerals will help with kind of protecting against that, pushing those heavy metals out of the enzyme binding sites where they can bind in the body. But you would also know to look into your immediate environment, what your child eats, and so on, to see what potential exposures there might be to those heavy metals that you can reduce. So that's a little primer just to give you an idea of the importance of minerals. Minerals are very important because they are not very easily replenishable in the soil. So I think I talked about this in a previous episode, when farmers farm, they grow plants, those plants take up those minerals in the soil. Once you harvest the plants, farmers don't generally replenish all the minerals back into the soil. This is why the world has become very, the humans I'm talking about in the world have become very nutrient depleted in terms of minerals, in terms of essential minerals like zinc, selenium, these things that I was talking about earlier. So it's very important to test your child to see if there are any nutrient inadequacies, mineral inadequacies, and address them. Because, like I already said, the point of this episode was to introduce you to how the research has shown that inadequacy or deficiency in these minerals can predispose us to increased toxic burden or increased absorption of toxic metals, which is, of course, not good for our health. And of course, with younger children, there is their detoxification capacities are not as well developed as an adult, so it will affect them more. So this is something you really need to address, and for future episodes, we'll talk about it in more detail. So thank you for listening to this one, and I hope to see you on the next one.